Welcome, everybody. Welcome to NAVA. My name is Jody Leo, and I'm the Chief Delivery Officer here. I'm so happy to see you all in the room with me today and to say hello to everyone online. To our distinguished guests, Emily, Nick, Greg, and Martel, I want to thank you for joining our panel today. Martel will give a more formal introduction in just a moment. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. For those of you who have joined at past events, welcome back. A little bit about NAVA. NAVA is a public benefit corporation on a mission to make government services simple, effective, and accessible to all. We're a growing team of over 300, and as we scale, our mission remains the same. We partner with federal and state government agencies to build human-centered services, and in the process, solve some of the thorniest and most complex, highly scrutinized technology modernization challenges. Now on to the subject of today's event. The context, around a year ago here in this same room, we had the pleasure of hosting Jen Falca for a fireside chat about her book, Recoding America. In that book, Jen writes, government at all levels has limped into the digital age, offering online services that can feel more cumbersome than the paperwork that preceded them, and widening the gap between policy outcomes we intend and what we get. This is certainly something we see in our work at NAVA and work so hard to address. For years, Jen has been drawing attention to a key contributor of this issue, a problem that she calls the implementation gap. She writes, and I quote, "Much of the failure is not deliberate. It is the result in part of an outdated model that keeps policymaking and implementation on separate domains with separate skills and incentives. The impact of these outdated models becomes increasingly dire in a landscape where the work of government grows more and more complex. One area where we see this divide between policy and implementation shows up, and an opportunity for addressing it is in academia, where university programs often focus exclusively on public policy or on public administration. This is a case of the implementation gap. Someone studying public policy, for example, might not get much exposure to what policy implementation, public administration, and service delivery look like. It's worth wondering, could this be a contributor of some kind to the challenges we're seeing when we're trying to put policies into practice? Today, we want to consider opportunities for doing things differently. How might universities bridge this gap in order to improve policy outcomes and increase government capacity for service delivery? What can we learn from recent experiments? What other ideas might be worth pursuing? To discuss these questions and more, we have a panel today with several distinguished guests who have written blog posts on this subject, in some cases written books. The panel will be followed by an audience Q&A and some networking. Now I want to introduce Martel Esposito, our Partnerships and Evaluation Manager at NAVA. And Martel will serve as our moderator and tell you a bit more about our panelists. Thank you again to all the panelists for joining us and to everyone who made it out today. And now over to you, Martel.
Thank you, Jody. I'm very excited to introduce our three guests today, our three wonderful panelists. I'm going to start with Emily. Emily Tavellarias is the managing chair of the Tech and Society Initiative at Georgetown University. She teaches two courses at the McCourt School of Public Health, one on School of Public Policy. I attend a school of public health, so that, you know.
We were just talking about it.
So sorry, McCourt. Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy, who I I have a lot of admiration for. She teaches one on public interest technology and another on human-centered design and public policy. And Emily was a founding member of the first agency level team of the US Digital Service at the VA. And she also served as a senior policy advisor to the US Chief Technology Officer at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Welcome, Emily. Thanks. We also have Nick Sinai, who is a senior advisor at Insight Partners, where he works with portfolio companies entering and growing in public sector, runs Insight's government advisory board, and helps invest in national security and dual use companies. He previously served in President Obama's White House as the US Deputy Chief Technology Officer, leading initiatives on open data and open government, and helping start the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program. Nick has also taught courses on government technology and innovation at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And he has also helped found the US Digital Corps, a 2-year fellowship for early career technologists, and is the co-author with Marina Nitsa of Hack Your Bureaucracy. After launching their book, Nick and Marina were actually featured here in this very room for a fireside chat with NAVA CEO Rohan. And then, so welcome, Nick. And last but not least, we have Greg, who has brought us all here today. So thank you, Greg. Greg Jordan Dedamore. Greg is working as a senior consultant for NAVA and was recently at Code for America as their Associate Director for Human-Centered Government, leading efforts to support public servants with resources and training on organizations' principles and practices for how government can and should serve the public in the digital age. Past work includes a range of both strategic and technical roles at Results for America and Sunlight Foundation as part of the What Works Cities initiative. He also writes Civic Insider, a blog and email newsletter focused on issues in the public sphere, of which one of your posts recently sparked this discussion. So welcome, Greg. Let's talk about the policy and implementation gap. Greg, let's start with you. As your article, your post sparked this discussion, can you tell us more about the gap?
Sure. As Jody was mentioning in her remarks, I don't really know like how this occurred to me, but I was just thinking about this at some point, and it kind of hit me that what I had been reading, what Jen describes so clearly as this gap between policy and implementation is right there in a lot of academic programs. And specifically, it's very different from what you see, for example, if you go to a business school, where you'll have everything from strategy through implementation all kind of together. And I don't know that there's any like grand reason that this happened. I mean, we'll talk about it a little bit. But once I noticed it, I was like, oh, like this seems like a sort of a cool thing to look at, and like maybe there's an opportunity here to bridge this gap and really to help create policies that are more implementable. Because I think, as a lot of us have seen, both in the digital realm, but also plenty of non-digital things, implementation is where policies can go to succeed or not succeed. And so if you're armed with more knowledge about implementation and how that works, you can create better policies. And also in the other direction too, like people who are doing what we see as implementation in a lot of ways are also kind of creating what you might call micro policy along the way. So like you're creating algorithms, whether that's designing a form, creating hiring processes, like choosing park benches, like all sorts of things that you do as implementation are basically small scale policy decisions. And so it can help if those people too are also armed with some of the sort of frameworks and I don't know, teachings of how to think about policy.
I think that's a really nice segue into what my next question, which was going to be, which is like, how does this gap manifest in practice? So it sounds like we have practitioners who are implementing policies and micro policies, and we have policy folks that maybe don't have the ideal amount of knowledge around implementation. So how does that manifest in practice? What are the consequences of the gap in these real world scenarios outside of academia? And essentially, why should we care about this gap as non-academics?
Well, I'll give you one reason is we're training a bunch of students in schools of government and policy, and they're being trained in economics and statistics, and that's not the work of government. Now, you need economists, you need people who have statistical training in, and obviously data sciences with a lot of statistics. But there's so much more to the work of government than economics. And yet that's the kind of foundation for a lot of these degrees. And so that really sets up a bad situation. So I had Sloan Gibson, who's the deputy secretary of the VA. He came and talked to some of my students, and he said, look, I did a calendar study, and the amount of time that I spend on policy was only a couple percentage points. He's the number 2, the COO of the agency. And he said, and those couple percentage points, that's basically remediating or fixing bad policy that was getting in the way of serving veterans. And so we kind of fetishize, we worship policy as the end all be all. And there is having had an MBA. So like I can see how that we don't worship strategy the same way in the business context, right? There is strategy, but there's also the actual doing and learning in for-profit organizations. And I think in government, we struggle with that sometimes.
I want to zoom out for just a minute and say a couple things about the policy implementation gap before I answer that question, which is that amen to everything that's been said already. And I think another way to think about the gap itself or to articulate it is that what you have is policy as the what are we trying to accomplish, and the implementation of how does that thing get accomplished, right? And those things are in 2 totally different spaces. So you mentioned earlier sort of Jen's book and how she talks about the skills and the experiences that are related to being able to do those things. And what happens, tying this to Greg's point about where academia comes in here, is that policy in the academy means something very, very specific. And what it means is essentially how a group of people decides what they want to do or what they want to accomplish. How that thing gets done is like not in the equation. So when you look at curricula across the schools of public policy, which I have done over the last few years, I've looked specifically at 6 of the top public policy schools in the country. How the thing gets done is not in the curriculum mostly, and if it is as a elective course, and that is only a tiny fraction of those students. What ends up happening, and I want to say very loudly for any of my academic friends who might be following, is like, this is not a critique, this is an explanation. And I think we're all on the same team in terms of wanting the policies that we articulate, that we decide when a group of economists comes together and says, here is a thing that needs to be done and here's what we think would help. We would like for this to succeed, presumably. And how we do that work needs to be, what needs to be true for that to be accomplished needs to be a part of the conceptualization of that policy to begin with. And what ends up happening in policy schools is the focus ends up being on the prioritization and the decision-making of what needs to be done, which is economics, largely, and statistics and modeling. Take a bunch of variables, put them into an algorithm, and it spits out a decision. And that is useful, but it is like an incomplete way of looking at problems. It is an incomplete way of looking at and understanding environments and potential solutions. So what ends up happening in the programming itself is that there's this sort of almost over glorification overvaluation of statistically significant studies and numbers, which are valuable, but not much room for like observable realities. Right, which is where things like user research and design research come in. But I wanted to add that there because I think that that's how I think about the gap, and then how I see it sort of manifesting on some level in the academy. But I think you also asked, how does it manifest in implementation?
Yeah, how does it manifest in practice? Like, how does the gap from
Mhm.
academia?
I'm gonna share
manifest
that.
on the ground?
I'm gonna share the
Yeah.
example I shared with you right before this. So this is a very silly, very mundane example, but a couple years ago, a new new legislation came out that essentially changed the eligibility requirements for GI Bill benefits, which is benefits that veterans receive for higher education. And like checks just stopped going out one day. And veterans call people, no one's paying attention, no one's listening. A month goes by, 2 months go by, people start getting kicked out of their apartments. Then people start paying attention. And my signal channel from all of my colleagues at the VA blows up, and all of us sort of simultaneously were like, no one checked the computers. And what ended up being the case is that the eligibility requirements changed, and I'm oversimplifying this, but basically, literally no one updated the computers to be able to process that eligibility. And it's that simple, right? It is if anything were to change on the academic side, I think for policy people to know to ask the question, if I want to accomplish X, where is technology a dependency or a requirement of what I am trying to accomplish? And who knows the answer to that question? And then listen to them.
Excellent, great examples. And I know particularly, Emily, you've also done research on the divide between public policy and public administration in academia. And you have insights on why the gap exists and what are the origins of this gap. So why are we in this situation where we have this divide in academia, we're seeing things manifest in actual practice? Why is it like this? Where did it come from?
Yeah, I know Nick also has a few insights. I'm gonna toss it over to you in a second too. But in short, if you rewind 150 years ago, there was a field and it was public administration. So the early part of the 1900s, early part of the 20th century, if you wanted to go into government or do work related to government, you would study public administration. Over the course of the following couple decades, 2 world wars and a Great Depression occur in the Western Hemisphere. And in the meantime, the world is becoming more entangled and closely connected through a number of different things, which I will not go into here, but trade, technology, transportation, all of these things, right? And the impact of the decisions of governments was starting to have a much larger ripple effect than it used to. And at the same time, the field of economics is emerging. And this leads to somewhat of an academic version of a throwdown in the academy, where there is a disagreement, a fight about what must be prominent for one to have the authority to speak, to work in, to make decisions on behalf of government. What is critical? What are the capacities and capabilities that are needed? And economics emerges as a core discipline there. And what you see throughout the 20th century is this shift from public administration to public policy, where literally some of the most famous policy schools in the world, I believe including HKS, used to be schools of public administration and rebranded to schools of public policy. And fun fact, in there is a giant injection of money from the Ford Foundation. But I'll just leave that as a little asterisk dangling in the ether, because fun fact, if you would like for academia to behave differently, money is really helpful sometimes. But yes, so that's really the genesis, is that econ starts rising and gains more traction as a way to sort of grapple and decision make and prioritize in a inherently more complicated world. And you also recently had some conversations about this. I don't know if you wanted to.
No, I think you described it really well. The thing that I would remind people is that schools of policy and schools of government are largely professional schools. That is, they are primarily training people to go serve in government, and then sometimes also nonprofit and other institutions. So there's always this question of, is it just to serve in government, or is it also to serve in nonprofits and other types of organizations? And so yes, people can get PhDs and become academics, but the bulk of the institution is dedicated towards the teaching of graduate students who are then going to go serve in government, right? And then so just stop there and then say, but the professors are mostly trained in disciplines, right? They are someone who's trained in international relations or statistics or behavioral economics, right? So you kind of have this divergence of the academics are thinking about things in a certain way, and the needs of the people who are going to start their careers in the public sector are very different. And so I think that kind of leads to the divergence and some of the challenges here.
Yeah. What really struck me about this conversation is that this division emerged out of a changing world, and the world has changed a lot since then, and it is continuing to change rapidly. So using your own words, what must be prominent? What is critical today for decision making today? And I want to dive a little bit into curriculum. I know you both teach at the intersection of academia and practice. You are actively trying to bridge that gap between those academic disciplines and the practice on the ground that the students are being prepared through their studies to go in and make some change. What have you done to try to bridge the gap in your own curriculum, and why? And how is that unique, and how does it fit into the overall public policy curriculum?
Sure. So I had the great fortune of designing and teaching a field class. And so the Kennedy School had a handful of field classes, but none in digital government. And so I created a class where teams of students, 4 or 5 students, would work with a client for an entire semester. They'd work with the VA, with the city of Boston, with census, and employ classic user-centered design, get out of the classroom and learn about the problem from Boston residents. And we have veterans, we have Boston City residents, we have all kinds of folks in Boston. And then come back, try and synthesize that research, do some brainstorming and trying to figure out kind of what the solution might be, and do some very lightweight prototyping, and then testing of usually paper prototypes or lightweight digital prototypes. And that process, get exposed to the idea of product and product management in government. I mean, this is very elementary service delivery but it's just not something that students have a lot of exposure to. And at the end, they would culminate in a demo day where they would present their research findings, but also their products and what they've learned, and then a series of recommendations. So we almost snuck into policy at the end, where at the end they had some recommendations for the VA or for the city of Boston, but most of the class was focused on the actual implementation, the actual delivery, and very much an iterative process. And the great thing about that is, if you pick great clients, and I happen to know a bunch of great clients, if you pick great clients, they're going to do a lot of the teaching. And if you put together interdisciplinary teams, and I had not only Kennedy School students, but also students from the college, the business school, the design school, the engineering school, et cetera. So you create a much more fulfilling experience. And But I also made it really hard for the students too. And I tried to scare our students. I said, like, this is not going to be an easy class, and we're going to do this Friday mornings from 9 a.m. to noon. And, you know, you're going to be working with the CTO of the VA. And you're going to be presenting to him or her at the end of this class. And so you better be on your A game. And by the way, you're going to blog about your experiences with client approval throughout the semester. So you can imagine learning about the whole communications process. I did not really think this through, because it meant that I was sitting there redlining a lot of blog posts before we submitted them for client approval. There's a little bit of a gap sometimes between the students' drafts and then what the VA would sign off on. But it was great learning experience for the students. And I think for some of them, it totally changed the trajectory of their careers. I mean, I had a software developer who's an undergraduate who said, I want to go into product management. I want to figure out what we make rather than just make stuff, because what we make and who we make it for is so critical, not just in the private sector, but in government as well. So, and students have gone on to work at NAVA, gone to work at VA, and started all kinds of things. So I really felt that the experiential or the field pieces were something that were lacking. And that was kind of what I tried to bring in my class.
So I'm hearing practice-based courses, real clients, real client engagements and experiences with approvals and many other things with clients, exposure to problem-solving techniques like human-centered design, iteration, with the goal of effective implementation. How does that relate to your courses?
Yeah. I took a similar tack, but a much smaller version of what Nick is talking about. We did not do clients. I tried that one semester, and for the kind of class that I was teaching, which I will say more about in a minute, a semester was not enough time. It was not enough time. It was too short to be able to extract the kind of learning that I really wanted them to. And also what they were getting was very sanitized, which I am, as my students, one of whom is in this audience, will attest to, I'm not a fan of. I don't like sanitized information. And which brings me to the class. The way I incorporate a field and a hands-on practical experience is the human-centered design and public policy course that I teach is oriented around a project that they solve, that they do at the school. So on like the second or the third week of class, the assignment is to write a little essay about what is frustrating about being a student at McCourt, which I still can't believe they let me do. Please don't stop. And what ends up happening is we do this like pattern finding exercise. The patterns tend to be very similar year on year. And then students kind of self-organize into groups, and that's the problem they are solving for. And what inevitably happens is the same every year. And this is one of my like meta learnings, which is they all start with well, what if they just this, and what if they just that, and why don't they just this? I'm like, those are all great ideas. Save them. Go talk to some people first. And they spend like 2 weeks talking to people across campus and come back, share what they're finding, and it turns out it's a little complicated. And I'm like, like that's the kind of learning that I want happening in the class. I tell the students over and over again, you are not going to come out of this class knowing how to do human-centered design. That's not the goal of this class. The goal of my human-centered design class is not to teach like a methodology or a set of tactics necessarily. It is to give them a new lens through which to see problems and to think about solutions. Full stop. That's what the class is about. I'm not pretending to teach them how to go and like run design research sprints. That's not what it is. Most of these students are going to end up in roles in government nonprofits, government adjacent organizations that are working on public problems, not running design sprints. And that's how I design my courses, is with that assumption that they're not going to end up focusing on this. It's just a new lens. So to your question around the learning and what kind of capabilities and capacities I think in our currently changing world are super important. I would say at the very, very top of that list is essentially sense-making skills. Is the easiest way for me to say that. Is the ability to understand where you are, what is going on, and how you are going to get from point A to point B. And this is key for this moment, when the floor that you are walking on is shifting. The ground beneath you is shifting. That, to me, is the number one skill for policy people, and probably many different disciplines right now. But that's it, is being able to navigate ambiguity. And as anyone who I see some of my colleagues in the audience will attest to, navigating ambiguity is a huge part of being able to get anything done in government in general, even in the best of times. The other things I would add to that list are questions to know that you need to ask as a policy person, no matter where you are in the institution. One is, if I want to accomplish X, who is most closely connected to that? Whose hands are on the keyboard or on the forms that affect this thing? And to talk to them. Two is, where is technology a dependency of the thing that I want to do? Meaning, where can technology either accelerate my goal, help me reach my goal, or block me from reaching my goal? And before you do anything, a single thing, even say out loud that you want to accomplish something, to go check that. And I'll give you an example of how this works in practice. In the Obama administration, during the Syrian refugee crisis, the president wanted to raise the cap on the refugee flow, on refugee intake in the United States. And before deciding what that number was, he asked people from the US Digital Service, from the State Department, and other organizations, essentially to check the system and identify what they thought the maximum capacity could be. So not arbitrarily picking a number that sounded really great in a press release, which is how things often work, but saying, what can this system currently handle? And is there anything we can do to change it feasibly in this time frame that will increase that number? Like, that's the kind of thinking that we need policy people to be using. So I'd say those are the big ones. And then the other is just a very basic, I think, some fundamental knowledge about what a digital product is and how they come to be would be really valuable. And that is some very, very basic information, like, what is a tech stack? What are the humans involved at each part? And how do you create an environment in which those people can succeed? You don't need to be the expert policy person. Just know that these people are around and can help you if you create the right space for them.
Great. So I heard sense-making skills. So this new lens for problem solving and for dissecting complexity. I heard navigating ambiguity. I heard asking the right questions and knowing who to ask. So another type of navigation, navigating ambiguity, navigating people, navigating who has the knowledge, and probably also the power and the influence. Understanding technology dependencies, and then also just understanding basic digital product knowledge and understanding. Great. So you all are doing wonderful things to try to bridge the gap between policy and implementation in these particular courses. But how do we close the gap beyond making a new course? For example, how do you think curricula in public policy and public administration needs to change or improve? Or maybe what are some non-curriculum remedies to close the gap?
I could start.
Yeah.
I think one thing, honestly, even just like recognizing this at all. So like something that I was thinking about recently was that so in terms of this sort of gap that we're talking about, there are a lot of institutions where like, yes, there's this gap, but also the like public administration part is just non-existent in general. And so like at my undergrad institution, there was a popular introductory management class called Management of Industrial and Nonprofit Organizations. So private sector, nonprofit sector. Public sector, nothing to be seen. You know, there were courses on public policy, but it stops there. And so the part about like public sector organizations existing and like having needs was just completely absent. And so like even just like literally recognizing the issue, I think is an important starting point. And then I think, you know, there's a lot that can be done to like incorporate this into existing classes. I mean, as to Emily's point, like you don't have to be an expert in all these different things. Like people can, you know, there are people who specialize in all sorts of different things, but just knowing a little bit, like 2 weeks worth of instruction about procurement is a lot better than zero, you know?
Or just knowing it's something you should.
What is it?
Yeah.
Right. Like hiring, you know, you know, lots of people have horror stories about government hiring processes, but like this stuff matters, you know, like this stuff makes or breaks programs. And so.
Great. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Oh, yeah, so many, but I've been talking a lot. Nick, do you wanna?
Yeah, I'll just say quickly that I do think that we can rethink the core classes in schools of government, schools of policy, and to make those more focused on implementation, more focused on the kinds of applied skills. So it's harder to do, and I have a little experience having taught a core class the last couple of years at the county school. So I took some of my learnings from doing a 20 to 25 person course and did a 60 person course. And that's just a very different dynamic where 60 people classes are much more focused on the case method and you know, giving out problem sets or homework that you can be graded, et cetera. It's just less applied. But I think you can find ways to do exercises in that context. And I changed my class around a lot in the second year that I taught it, where I said, okay, we're all going to do some basic prototyping of a particular thing, and it's going to be time bound, and we're going to figure out a way to do it in a half hour, and we're going to do it on a piece of paper, and then we're going to take a picture of it and upload it. Like there's ways to do basic skills in some of these areas. I think you could repurpose some of the statistics classes, right? So we have 2 semesters of required statistics at the Kennedy School. I think you could turn that second semester into a topics in data fluency and talk about standards in data. You can talk about the messiness, the bias, and the ethics of data, right? And power dynamics. You can certainly have applied pieces around building some APIs and engineering. There's so many like things that you could do with that second semester of statistics in topics and data of how that manifests in real life in government. So I think there's a great opportunity to rethink, but oftentimes what happens is, you know, these things turn into multi-year, let's study them and admire the problem in academia. We do this in government too, where we like to admire the problem. And I think you need to make small changes and build some momentum. And so yes, that does mean new electives, but it also means trying to change various core classes. And I'm also a big fan of how do you mash programs and schools together. And so, for example, HBS and the School of Engineering, C's at Harvard, have a joint degree program. There's a joint degree program between HBS and HKS, and students tend to be really lovely. Who have
And for those that you all probably know, but for those that don't, HBS, Harvard Business School versus HKS, Harvard Kennedy School of Government.
Yes. So I think that there are ways to continue to experiment with bringing schools together and kind of merging some of the.
And that's actually a really great segue into something else that I've been thinking about. None of us on this panel, you all and myself included, have NPP or MPA degrees. Yet we are all very interested in this policy implementation gap. So I think we have MBAs, international affairs, public health degrees, plus a lot of on-the-job learning with people who have MPPs and who have MPA skill sets. And so I was thinking perhaps part of the reason we're all interested is because we're somewhat outsiders looking in and seeing some potential for some positive change in some of this cross-disciplinary pollination and collaboration. So going a step further, what opportunities do you see perhaps with MBAs, but also beyond MBAs, to bring in approaches from other fields into core public policy or public administration pedagogy, which just means like teaching approach? And I wanted to start with Greg, because I know you had a very specific opinion about this in the post that you wrote about what if we just wrapped all of the degrees together? Does the degree
Hold on.
type will even matter?
I'm sorry, can I, before we jump into that, I wanted to also answer the previous question, if that's
sure.
all right?
Yes,
Because I think there are a couple specific
yes,
things
go ahead.
on policy schools before we go to mashing things up.
Sure.
Which like, yay for the mashing. Just so I'll tick through these very quickly. I fully agree with Nick that there are items in the core curriculum, that there are areas of the core curriculum that you could slide these learnings into. So I think there's some kind of a mapping exercise to be done between what do all students who go through these programs have to do and take, and what are the learning objectives that we think are important for students to have and graduate with, and where do they match naturally, and just slide them in. So no new things, just slide them into existing things. Two is, I think, more clinic type models. So like taking a page from the law school book and playing with the clinic model is thing number two. I think three is that it's not just pedagogy, it's research. I think the researchers and I think the professors need to start engaging more with implementers who do the work related to what they're studying. And I think Georgetown is doing a fabulous job with this. Don Moynihan in particular, Pam Hurd, and folks at the Better Government Lab who are constantly engaging with practitioners, I think is really important. And the last thing is, and this cannot be said more emphatically, is the role of leadership in the universities and creating incentives that reward researchers and faculty for doing more work related to implementation. I think there's a lot more to say about that. So I'm
No, it's
not
all good.
make sure we didn't
No,
lose that
you
thread. Yeah.
you did great, and I was just moving us along
No, I
because of
know,
time,
this
but
is
you
time,
did a really nice, concise ad there, so appreciate that. So with all of that in mind, all of this, all of these ideas around core curriculum and electives, and borrowing things from other fields, does a degree title matter? Should we just be mashing up everything? Should we not be mashing up everything? In a way, in practice, when we get into the real world, we are mashing up everything. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's an opportunity for mashing, or at least for those students who are interested. And in particular, it's very interesting. Like if you look at a lot of universities that'll have a school or program of, public policy, public administration, government, whatever. And then over here, they'll have a business school and they're teaching about a lot of the exact same things, like it's formulating, ideas on strategy, depending on how much implementation stuff you do or don't have in your public policy school. There's a lot of times the same classes where they'll just put the word business in front of one or public in front of the other. But like the content in many cases is the same. And it seems like, and in other cases, it isn't, but it seems like there's an opportunity for bringing things together, especially in an environment where a lot of people will work across multiple sectors over the course of their careers. Like I think about it in terms of how do you build a strong, like flexible foundation that people can then, that'll be useful 2 years from then, but also 10 years from then or 20 years from then. And I know so like Nick, for example, not to point him out, but like he has an MBA, like he has spent a bunch of time working in the public sector and the private sector. I've spent a ton of time working in the nonprofit sector, but like focused on improving government. There are, all over the place, all these kinds of different interactions. And so I think there's an opportunity also when you think about like case studies. So a lot of, for example, you go to a business school classroom and they'll have a bunch of case studies. And let's say it's a class on, how do you motivate your workforce? And I read a bunch of case studies on how businesses motivated their workforce. It's like that, like, the topic of motivating workforce is just as relevant in the public sector. And it seems like you don't need to have the two sides just like saying, we're gonna put up blinders and only read case studies from our sector, the stuff over there, that's something else. So anyway, that's just a thought there. Or even just get them talking to each other. I mean, yeah.
I just building on that quickly, I do think there are certain disciplines where the topics are very similar, right? So if you're talking about leadership, if you're talking about product management, if you're talking about setting goals and those kinds of things, even in the topic of marketing, I think there's still some similarities, and oftentimes we're hesitant to use the M word in government, and I think that's unfortunate. We call it other things like public engagement or outreach or but at the end of the day, some of the same strategies and skills are the same. But you also have different cultures in schools of business and schools of government. You have different faculty, and so there's some students who come to a school of government because that's what they're looking for, and it's not okay to just say, well, I want a business education for government, right? Because we've learned the limits of that.
I mean, I don't disagree. But I'll add a strong and here, which is, and the incentives of both of those universes are fundamentally different. The priorities of business are to make profit. The priorities of government are to serve the public. And it's not that these two things are like, they cannot coexist. They absolutely can. And there are so many fantastic scholars who write about this and study this, people doing that work. But I do think at the end of the day, that fundamental difference does mean to me that they should be distinct and also compare notes a lot more than they do. So there are things like, how do you build a product that's functional in the world? Like, the answer to that might vary a bit in government because of the context in which you are making those decisions. But what the product is and what it looks like and how you decision make is basically the same. But there are very significant differences. And I think that training people appropriately and educating them to work in a government context does require them to understand that context acutely. And for the world of technology, that means things like legacy infrastructure is a thing. I think Mikey Dickerson teaches a class. Mikey Dickerson was he was the first administrator of the US Digital Service. He currently teaches a class at Pomona College, which I think is fascinating and everyone should go check out, which is about crisis engineering. And he started this class because as a CS person, he saw these CS curricula and students coming out of CS schools and realizing what they can do is build something from scratch. And that's actually not how you build anything in the world. Definitely not in government, right? Like, you're always starting from somewhere and you have to deal with these immovable constraints of like the infrastructure that is already there. How do you give people the knowledge to do that? And I think the same way about the non-technical aspect of that, right? You can talk about how to build a company from scratch, how, entrepreneurship, intrapreneurship, right? And the confines of government and the constraints of government are very particular kinds of constraints. And knowing what they are and how to work with them is really critical. So yay to mashing, yes to comparing notes. I also think the low-hanging fruit in mashup is probably within the policy schools themselves. Because when you start looking at the curricula between like public administration, public management, public policy, there's a lot of overlap. So I don't know enough about how the schools work to understand what would happen and what the reasons would not be to not do that. I'm sure they exist. But disciplines exist for a reason. They are important. But I think it's important to be clear-eyed about what each excels in and make sure that they're not too narrow in their scope.
Great. And also being able to speak the language of the other discipline.
Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah.
the
At least,
kind
yeah.
of came up.
And one thing I kind of think about is like, if you think about law schools, or like if you think about a criminal courtroom, obviously there's a lot to the legal profession beyond criminal courtrooms, but like you have a prosecutor and a defense attorney and a judge, and they all went to law school, even though like specifically a prosecutor and defense attorney have fundamentally opposite objectives, and like one of them winning means the other one losing. But like to be a good defense attorney, you ought to be able to get into the mind of a prosecutor and understand what they're going to do, even if your goal is the opposite. Or like to be a good prosecutor, you want to understand what the defense is going to say, even though again your goal is the opposite. And to be a judge, you want to, do other stuff. And it could have evolved, that we had different schools where like you go to a school of prosecutorial law versus defensive law versus judgeship. But it didn't. And I think it's because we recognize the value of there being things that everyone needs to understand, even if you're going to specialize in just one of them. And also that a lot of people, just like what I was saying about how people will move back and forth between the public or private or nonprofit sectors over the course of a career. If you look at, say, a judge, like a lot of times they might have previously been a prosecutor or defense attorney or whatever, or, people will play different roles in the legal profession throughout their careers. And so it helps to have them be able to think from multiple angles.
That's I've learned a lot from this discussion myself, and I've also been thinking a lot about this topic of policy and implementation for a while. But I want to end on a question around what we can be doing now. So this discussion has centered on academia, and there's a lot of us that want to be bridging this gap while working on problems that could, benefit from this more holistic policy and implementation perspective now in practice, like not when we were in school 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago. So what can people be doing now who have been trained on maybe the policy side, or maybe those who are trained on the implementation side, or maybe those who have a lot of on-the-job experience thinking about that bridging of policy implementation? What can we be doing to bridge the gaps in our own skills now?
I would start with asking yourself a question, which is, if you want to be, what are you trying to accomplish? And what needs to be true to accomplish that thing? Agnostic of what it is. And that can include anything from this policy needs to change to I need someone who understands X, Y, or Z. And really use that as like a starting point for an exercise in thinking about what the gaps are in your own either knowledge or skill set or resources, and really start there. But I do think at the end of the day, if knowing that the gap exists is like step number one. Is that things don't just magically happen, right? As we all can attest to. If you want to accomplish something, what needs to be in place for you to succeed, or for that thing to succeed? And that question is not the second question, it's the first question. Oh yeah, you would like to do that? Great. So is it feasible? What needs to be there for it to be feasible? And if it's not, rework it. So there's this like handoff, and I think changing that mentality of thinking about, I want to accomplish X, now you figure out how to do it, needs to stop. Thing number one.
For me, and I can only speak to the Kennedy School experience because that's where I've taught. The MPP, the Masters in Public Policy degree, they have a required kind of capstone thesis for their second year. They call it the PA, the Policy Analysis Exercise, I think. But it's basically a year-long thesis. And so there's a scramble in the fall to figure out what you're going to do, who the client is, and then all of the work on it, and then it culminates in spring. And the best theses are ones that are done with clients that are engaged, that the students are excited, often in a team, to work on. I always encourage students to be iterative, to try and design or create artifacts that the client can use, and not waterfall it, i.e. don't just show up at the very end, big thing, but how do you turn in various pieces of what you're working on with the client throughout. So for all of you, either in government or government contractor, There are hundreds of students at the Kennedy School, but if you start multiplying that by all of the schools of government policy, that means thousands or tens of thousands of students who are probably who need to write some sort of at least year-long thesis, and sometimes it's a semester. And so if you can think about problem statements, if you can raise your hand and say, hey, if students want to work on this problem with me, I will devote some real time. And, students hunger for impact and meaningful problems. And when you're working in government, and if you're working supporting government, you see real meaty problems, and you see things that if you had a team of really hardworking students, they would learn a lot by diving deeper, by trying some things and failing, but also learning. And as long as it doesn't turn into 100-page report that no one's going to read, I think that it's going to be valuable both for you as a client and for the students.
Great, and we might learn some things from the students along. So,
And you might hire them.
and we might hire them.
I would like to create, the Staples easy button. You can get like physical easy buttons. This is not one word. It probably doesn't really fit on a button, but I'd like to create an easy button that says, how is this actually going to work when it comes to hiring or procurement? Because, and the great thing is, like, let's say you work in a legislative office, like, you don't have to be an expert on, everything in the weeds there, but even just like asking the question can be a huge thing. So like, as a quick anecdote, I have a friend who works so when you think about like government, there's like delivering services, whatever, but then also making laws and regulations about what people and organizations can and can't do. And that might not seem like service delivery, but like there actually is like, there's a whole process to that. Like, as it turns out, making laws and regulations doesn't mean that they actually get followed always. And so like, I have a friend who works at one of the major financial institution regulatory agencies, and he's a data scientist. And what they do is, so there are these laws about what certain financial institutions can and can't do. And they have data scientists who are looking at data on what these institutions do to try to figure out if they may have broken the law. And so, there's lots of said there, but like, it took them a very long time to hire all that stuff. And so you probably don't think like hiring timeline for data scientists as a thing that impacts like financial regulatory enforcement, but it actually is. And you don't have to be able to forecast that all out, but like asking the question, like, okay, like we want financial regulations. How is that actually going to work? Or like trying to think about that, I think can lead to asking good questions.
Very relevant to this whole topic in DC about whether there should be an agency to regulate AI, right? Then how are you going to actually create that?
They'll create it later and yeah.
Oh, can I wait one more small plug? I really like who I think it was Jen Palka has this thing that she describes about like the Schoolhouse Rock video. That's like how a law gets made, and it's like, it goes through all these committees, blah blah blah, Congress, president signs it, and then it's done, and people say that's the end. But I being her, whoever, thinks of that as just the beginning, right? That's like a whole bunch of other stuff gets kicked off. So even like in high school, or we've got a group of 8th graders coming today, like, you don't have to bore them with like, the details of some of this stuff, but just like letting people know there's like something that happens after you pass a law, and it's kind of significant in terms of whether your intentions become reality or not, would be just a helpful high-level thing to know. And also that state and local government exist and matter.
Well, that's because like the laws, right? Like that, you pass a law, congratulations, that was really hard work. Now someone has to go implement that. That person is either in the executive branch or the state and local government. And if what you wrote either doesn't make sense, is too complicated, or is literally not implementable, how's that gonna go? It's like, we're all on the same team, presumably.
Wonderful ending to our panel today. We will not total ending, just ending for the initial chat. So I want to give everyone a round of applause. I think Q&A, if we have time.
We have time for questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
I echo all of the thanks
This has just been a super great and engaging conversation. Greg, I think it's actually just super interesting also that you thought that private sector, that they're the ones who got this right. I spent an unconscionable amount of time in consulting mergers and acquisitions very specifically. And a lot of my initial clients were, individual mergers and acquisitions clients, right? So figuring out, okay, this is the market sizing that we have. Here are the strategic initiatives that we have for this acquisition. How do we advise our client to go this way or that? And that was fine. And that was great, right? We make a recommendation, hands clean, you got your deck, all the things. It wasn't until that I was consulting in an in-house mergers and acquisitions group that was cycling through these every 3 months. And my compensation was tied to not just the performance of a single project, but the performance of a group that I learned also the very critical importance of like post-merger integration, right? Like, where do butts and seats go? Like, after we buy this, what do we report to the streets and prove that this was successful? Or what do we report to our constituency? Sometimes these are not even public things. So I say all that to say, right? Is there a way when we are thinking of how to make implementation a more concretized and more front of mind thing for folks? Is there a way to tie, I don't want to say compensation, but policy outcomes, right, more closely to policy delivery so that folks can kind of feel, right? Is there a way that we can sneak that into the tail end of the policy itself? Like, hey, in 3 months, here is the marker, or in a half a year, right? So that the people that are writing these things will have to have at least some sort of ear or mind towards, okay, this is how this affects, or these are how these outcome affects what's going on, if that makes sense.
And I would like to add one layer of complication on top of that.
Please do.
How do you overcome the legislative cycles of that are very short, and people are congratulating themselves for passing the law, and that is what is getting them motivated to pass the law so they can get reelected. So how do we incentivize within the context of this I don't want to say short-sighted, but these short turnarounds of results that we need to see in our political system?
I got a quick answer for you. That's people flow.
Okay.
So, I'm thinking of a particular individual who was in the House and then came over to work in the executive branch and work in the White House. And he remarked to me, he's like, God, it's so much harder in the executive branch to get something done. So many more people you have to check with, and so many more moving pieces. And I was like, you're working in the White House. Like, you're still just like telling people to do stuff, and like you're still like very far removed from the actual implementation. So
Yeah. Come check out how it's going at the VA.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
but that move from Congress to the executive branch, I think for this individual opened up the aperture of how hard implementation is, and how many dependencies it has, technology and people and unions and all these other things that are, and all the different stakeholders. And so I think if we can find ways to have this people flow, that is, people who are implementing come into legislative bodies, for example. And I know the AAAS fellowship tries to bring scientists into Congress so that they can advise. You can have more scientific minds in Congress. I know there's Tech Congress, those kinds of things where you have people with the experience of either being in leadership, in policy, or in implementation, also getting a chance to serve in the legislative branch and vice versa. I think that helps, where just avoid stuff like being too prescriptive in legislation, because you see that all the time where it's like, this is the way it's going to run. And you're like, well, wait a second. People writing the law don't actually, like, they have a conception of how this is going to work, but it's actually grounded in knowledge from 10 or 20 years ago. And so just avoiding some of that prescriptiveness would be a huge win. And I think people flow is not a panacea, but it can help some of those problems.
I'm thinking about your law school analogy. I'm gonna keep thinking about that, because that's, I think it's a very interesting analogous space to government. It assumes people will spend their careers there though, but like to your point about people flow, you know, when you go to law school, you learn about law, lots of different areas of law, lots of different roles and environments, and the ability to sort of context switch and understand how things happen in different places is super critical. The other one that I would add is related to how we measure and talk about success. And Jen Paulka's book spends a lot of time on accountability and oversight. And if you're interested in this topic, I just highly recommend reading the book, Recoding America. Success is currently defined, and this is an oversimplification, but it's currently defined largely by, did you do the thing that a bunch of people decided was going to happen and wrote down on a piece of paper? Did you do that on time and on budget? Did you check all those boxes? And two, did you follow the processes in place that you are legally bound to, or that the organization has articulated? Notice that neither of those two things are, did the thing that you wanted to happen? No, not a measure of success, right? So I think it's that simple. Like, to my mind, it's about adding. You don't even have to remove those two other things. But for now, even just adding, did you achieve the outcome you set out to achieve as a measure of success and as something that you can be held accountable for not doing? Especially if you are dealing with contractors. And this has all roads lead to procurement. Right? What I just described is also baked into the procurement problem, because what you do is you're holding contractors accountable for a thing a bunch of people in suits who sat down and wrote things down on a piece of paper, wanted you to do. Anyone who has ever worked on a project like that knows that's never how it goes. And in the realm of procurement, it's always a much more useful starting point to say, what are you trying to accomplish? Don't tell me what the specs of this thing are going to be. Tell me what you're trying to do. And I think that's all of my answers circle around that, is like different tactics to elevating that as a source of accountability, that as a measure of success.
I add a thought? I think one, to your question, another one would be like more open communication with people who are doing on the ground implementation, and like legal ability to talk to them and like taking more of an interest. So I know someone actually who's in this room was telling me once about how there were different kind of legislative mandates coming in the pipeline. And there were things that were going to be a problem when it comes to implementation, but like their office is not legally allowed to talk to the legislators who do this. And so unless it's like bubbling all the way up to the top and then getting over there, like the people who are making this thing that's creating all these problems are not hearing about these problems. And so like it would help if the people writing the laws would take more of an interest in this. But B, I feel like there's got to be some way of building more channels for like legal communication with the people who are trying to make this stuff happen.
Amen. And I have very low hopes that it will be like a formal legal path. And because I also think that this is so critical, I think informal channels are also unbelievably powerful. So just, hey, people who are working on the Hill, go to some executive branch happy hours, like start inviting each other to things, just talk with each other and create that base of trust. So there doesn't have to be a formal invitation. You can just talk to each other. And if and when the formal thing happens, for it to be truly starting from a place of interest and not performative or fear-based, which is like one of the main challenges with the Hill, is that even when you do have an opportunity to go have a conversation, it's not a conversation. You're either getting yelled at or you're walking on eggshells, and for any number of reasons. And that, I think those more of those spaces where people can truly like interact and exchange valuable information are so important.
It could also help for hearings with government officials to, in my opinion, it would be good to turn off the cameras so that they are
Yeah.
conversations and not TV/Twitter spectacles.
We're at time, sorry.
That's okay, sorry.
Oh, no, give Julie a mic.
Please stick around, I want to be respectful of everyone else's time in the room and online, but please stick around and chat with us for a few minutes after.
Thank you.
All right.
I can just talk really loudly on top.
I want to hear.
Do it.
Are you going in and seeing?
And we could probably do your question.
Are you sure?
Okay, we'll do that.
Hey, so we talked about law, real quick. I didn't know it's this law, I don't care.
It's not, it's not.
Okay, great.
For the
We talked about law, and so we talked about policy, which is not law, and we talked about implementation, which has to abide by the law. So where do we teach how to hack the law? Cause we all have our examples of how we've changed the law to make technology work to implement the policy that we need to get done. Are we not there yet? Is that the second order business of curricula, or do you all have some plans?
No plans, but I do think it's as simple as what you were saying before about legislative, executive branch. I do think policy schools and law schools have a lot to learn from each other and need to communicate more. I think policy schools actually could learn a lot from law schools and the way that they work. And also law schools could learn a lot about you know, what policy looks like in practice and from the kind of people who are attending those schools as well. And the elements of the equation that the
But
fact
you know, it's the implementers who often help the policy folks figure out how to bend the law to get the thing done that need to get done. So it's everybody's responsible, not just policy folks.
Yeah,
Implementers too.
I really just think it's
Yeah.
more of the comparing of the notes and the more spaces where people can talk to each other.
Yeah, and even just like, and like, just a little bit of instruction on this point of like, you don't just write laws and then magic happens. Like the anecdote I said about the data scientist doing financial regulation, like even just like hearing little things like that, I think can like help you learn a lot about like, oh, there's more to this than just, you know, writing laws and then waving your hands.
I think schools of government do not focus enough on the administrative state and all the regulatory state. And those are so legal. I think they'd be, you know, better served to have a grounding there, and comparing notes, I think would be, with law schools, would be important.
Great. All right. I think we are officially at time. So thank you again to our panelists. In the room, please stay and ask additional questions. Nice conversation.
Yeah.
Thanks.